I wanted to talk today about parenting and spirituality. First of all, I think that it's totally reasonable to be a parent and still be interested in spirituality, um, to the nth degree, seeking higher power, anything. Spirituality is not reserved for those people who want to hide in the mountains or people who live alone. But I think that anybody has the opportunity, particularly these days with all the information out there, to look into themselves and see if there's some sort of spiritual truth in life. I have a 17-year-old son who is definitely a major handful. And he's the kind of kid who is fairly rebellious and fairly stubborn. And so that leads to a lot of arguments and fighting. And when that happens, it's hard for me to assimilate that type of argument and fighting and anger with my son with my spiritual life. And, I feel like I've come a long way spiritually and inwardly and have found moments of great peace. And then at the same time, when my son is late for curfew or isn't doing his schoolwork, I feel like I get super mad and we yell and scream at each other and I feel guilty about it. And then I sit back and I wonder what the heck just happened, and really, have I gotten anywhere in my spiritual life? And so I think that parenting is not just a thing to avoid as a person interested in spirituality, but a real opportunity to sort of understand yourself and to become aware of yourself within that relationship, just like any relationship. And when my son came to live with me a few years ago, I was given that gift of learning about myself. I think that parenting is a particularly challenging issue for those involved in the spiritual search because, you can sort of relate parenting to any relationship with anyone, and how to navigate those relationships without any kind of conflict. And I think that the biggest areas for conflict with our children are our hopes and expectations for them, which are not always met. The resulting fear and anxiety when we don't think they're meeting those expectations, all of the worry we have for them, but also, quite frankly, the anger towards our children. And, I think it's sad to say, but, the more I learned about myself and my relationships, the most contested relationships in my life have been with family. And isn't that ironic that, the people that we have the most trouble with, the most conflict with, the most anger and fighting and terrible issues with are the people who we say we love. And that's what I have found as I look into myself to understand the difficulties in my relationship with my son. So I think ultimately a lot of what ends up being the main issue with our children is control. We want to control them because we think that if they do what we tell them to do, that they're going to do better, they're going to be happier, and we know what's best for them. And, we do that with other people as well, whether it's significant others or other family members or friends. But in particular with children, it almost seems like society encourages that and frankly expects that of parents. It's our job, because our children are young, underdeveloped psychosocially, it's our job basically to steer them in the right direction. And I think to me that is the main issue with parenting as opposed to other relationships, because you've got sort of almost a conflict there. So there's almost a paradox there, isn't there? Because on the one hand, they're very young and they need our guidance. But on the other hand, any form of control with our children can potentially turn into conflict. And I think that that's what makes the parent-child relationship a little different than your typical relationship. So what do? So we're having massive arguments with our children. And what is our response to all of that? Well, we don't want to fight with our children. We want to be happy, have happy relationships with our children. And so then comes in all the parenting books, right? Here's how to fix the problem. And, you know, I've looked into those books, and a lot of them, to my view, really show us how to more subtly manipulate our children. And I'm not a parenting expert. I'm only an expert in myself, in what I've seen as I've tried to relate better with my child, while upholding what I consider to be my responsibilities to my child. And so I think the first thing that I decided is that a lot of those parenting books make things more complicated than they are, and that I don't feel like my relationship with my son will benefit from those things. The only thing that I think my relationship with my son will benefit from is trying to not have all this conflict in our relationship. So I think in a lot of ways, a lot of the parenting manuals, what you should do to try to fix that circumstance, only remove us from the central issue, which is the conflict. So if we can set aside the way to fix the problem, then perhaps we can start to really be honest with ourselves about the tremendous amount of conflict in these relationships. And if you are able to put the methods to fix your problem aside, then I believe that you can really become in contact with your relationship and how your thought process gets in the way of your relationship with your child. So let's look at a specific example and try to see if we can kind of learn from it a little bit. So all of a sudden I find myself in this massive argument. I'm yelling and screaming at my son. He's yelling at me, I'm yelling at him. Nothing gets resolved. Nothing is helped by that process. People say things they don't mean. People can barely think straight when they're arguing like that. I walk away from that circumstance. And what happens next? Next, I think back on that, don't I? I create an image in my mind of my son, a picture. And I hate that because he's not doing what I want him to do. And that is really the seed of our conflict, our thought process. We create pictures of each other in our minds. These pictures are what we hate. These pictures are what we create anxiety over. And all these feelings come up. Very often we're not even in the same room as the other person. So that all causes all of this inner turmoil. That all makes us very upset. Our thinking process, thinking back on my son, thinking back on how he let me down and how upset I was and why I was upset and all the thoughts that go into that. They start with an image of my son, a picture in my mind. I recall my son, and with that comes everything else. That all becomes this inner anger, sadness, whatever. That's the mess. Now I want to do something about that, right? That's when I run to the books. That's when I run to advice from other people. That's when I try to think about what I should do to solve that problem. We never really think about just trying to be aware of the root cause of our anger. Now you could say the root cause of the anger is my son's behavior. But it's his behavior that I respond to. And I think that we have to take responsibility for our responses. Because the only thing that's creating conflict within ourselves is our responses to our children or to anything. So this is how we start to learn about ourselves with our children. We learn about ourselves with our children as we attempt to relate to them. And when these issues crop up that cause anger, that cause sadness or anxiety about our children, is it possible to go in and look at ourselves? I think it absolutely is. It is possible to become aware of our responses to how we handle what our children do. All of this inward action that takes place. And so I think we can become aware of that. And then more deeply that we're aware of that, the more deeply we get an inkling into how perhaps there's another way to approach the circumstance.